Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this event hosted by the Center for Policy Research. This is a release of a report on a topic that we've been working on for a while. The report is titled From Margins to Mainstream, State Climate Change Planning as a Door Opener to a Sustainable Future. It's a long title, and hopefully it'll make more sense once we get further into the program. I particularly want to add my welcome to colleagues from Brazil, Russia, South Africa, China, and Mexico who are here for a meeting organized by Oxfam and the Delhi Science Forum. It's a meeting across town, and they've sort of concluded a little early so they can join us here, and they're holding a separate workshop today and tomorrow. So welcome in particular to all of you who've come a long way. I also want to mention that those colleagues who've come from that meeting have to leave a little bit early to go back to their conference dinner, but please don't take that as a sign that the event is over and, signal a mass exodus. They have to leave early, not everybody does. Okay, so the objective really of this meeting and the work that we did is this. The question we were trying to ask is, how can we as a society mainstream and integrate environmental sustainability with climate change understood as a factor in that sustainability? How do we mainstream this into our development planning and action process? That's the central question we wanted to ask. The concrete context for doing this, the concrete context for doing this is state action plans on climate change. So many of us, maybe until a few months ago, weren't aware that 22 states in India have actually started the process of formulating state action plans on climate change. And 9 of these plans have been approved. This is in response to a call by the Prime Minister in 2009 to start this process of state climate planning, and it really was a response to trying to integrate the National Action Plan into a larger, into the work of the states. Can we get the lights back on? It's a little dark. Okay, we can keep going. Thanks. So the idea was really to look at what these 22 states have done, try and assess them a little bit analytically, and to talk about what this means for this idea of mainstreaming. Now, we have with us a panel that I will introduce in a minute to help us think through this, but I just want to note for the moment that the panel do not consist of climate junkies, and there are sufficient numbers in this town. They are people who work on environment and development in a very sort of mainstream kind of way. And the objective really is to have that discussion, because I think that if we have a separate climate discussion, if we continually have discussions about climate change as if it has nothing to do with energy, air, water, agriculture, then we will have failed. So the idea here is really to have that discussion about how to integrate these different issues. So we were motivated by 3 reasons really why we undertook this study. 3 reasons why we think this is a useful discussion to have and why we did this report. The first is, the clue is in the title. Every time I told people we were doing a study on state action plans, the word I got back from people at UNDP and other places was, look, that's sort of a marginal topic. It's really in the margins, which I thought was intriguing, given that for at least a few decades, those of us who worked on environmental sustainability and development have been asking increasingly for policy that isn't in silos, where there's discussion that integrates across different dimensions of policymaking. Now, unintentionally or intentionally, that's what state climate plans try and do. They look at, so there are often 15, 18, 20 departments that are pulled together to construct these plans. So this is de facto an effort, as we'll find out, flawed sometimes, an effort to integrate. So given this, I think it's time to move that discussion from the margins to the mainstream, to really think about how we can use these plans. The second reason we did this is that for those of us who care about sustainability, I think we have to start being serious about what the implications of climate change are for environmental sustainability. What implications does it hold for how we manage our resources, how we do coastal area development, how we develop our energy systems, what it means for urbanization. Increasingly, the evidence suggests that we can't ignore climate change. In other words, sustainable development needs to be updated to internalize the likely effects of climate change. How do we go about doing that? And these state plans are, in fact, the vehicle to do that. The third reason is a practical one. A lot of effort, money, time, attention by state government officials, NGOs, and donors has gone into this. It really doesn't make sense to do this if it's just a box to be checked. and the Ministry of Environment and Forests, in fact, has a 9-step checklist, have we satisfied? That's not efficient. That's not really a good use of resources. That's not good enough. The question is, what have we learned from this? And how can it actually change and improve development practice? And these plans are likely to be iterative. They're likely to be done again and again. So the question is, how do we make sure it's done better and the results are actually used? So what did we do? We had limited resources and limited time, so we looked at 5 states: Karnataka, Madhya Pradesh, Himachal Pradesh, Odisha, and Sikkim. And the states were chosen to have a spread across different geographies in India, also to get a spread across size and administrative capacity, agroclimatic context. So some states where forests were a big part of the story, some states where water, some states where coastal areas were important. And we also looked for a spread across the involvement by different donor agencies, because there were different donor agencies involved in all of these different states. We wanted to see if that made a difference. We visited the states, we read through these plans, and because we read through these plans, maybe you won't have to, and that's probably all for the best. They're very, very long, somewhat cumbersome documents, as these kinds of documents tend to be. In the folder, you'll find detailed analysis of each of the 5 states, along with a synthesis report. We did lots of interviews with central government people, with NGOs, with donors, and with their consultants. We didn't really end up talking to any business people because we didn't find them involved in the plan process in any way, which itself tells a bit of a story. Our focus was on how the plans were created, some assessment of the content, but we weren't asking the question, is this a good action item or is this a bad action item? We were trying to understand how these all added up in terms of the thrust of the plan overall. So again, our focus was on whether and how climate planning can open the door to more sensible and strategic engagement around environmental sustainability, and that's what we're hoping to focus the discussion on today. So for the remainder of the time we have here, this is how we envision the evening unfolding. In a minute, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Anu Jogesh, who has done the bulk of the work on this report, who's going to take us through the findings. She'll conclude with sort of handing over to me for just one slide on our recommendations, just in brief, at which point I'll invite the panel up to give their reflections. I've asked the panel to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes to begin with, to just lay out a few issues, after which I will do my best effort at sort of being a TV host and facilitate a discussion among the panel, but very soon after that invite in questions from the audience and try and really make this a broad discussion. So that's how we're hoping the rest of the event will unfold. So with that, let me hand it over to Anu for a quick summary of the findings.
Good evening, everyone. So the entire process of looking at 5 state action plans on climate change has largely been an inductive one. So what we're going to do is we've distilled a number of findings that have emerged from this very empirically rich study. And I'll try and give examples as I go along. But first, to give you a sense of how we structured the broad themes, or rather the questions around which we structured the entire study. We looked at the approach in terms of how are these plans conceptually framed. For instance, how is a climate plan different from any other state development exercise? And how does this framework determine what follows in the plan? Process, what were the steps taken, individuals and institutions involved, because we know that process dictates outcomes. And it can integrate or lock in silos, it can stimulate or silence voices. Outcomes, what were the concrete recommendations that actually emerged, and what shapes the form and content of these plans in terms of drivers? And here I will add what Navroz just did, is that we didn't try to weigh the merit of each recommendation in absolute terms, but rather see how the approach and the process actually dictated these outcomes and what they amount to collectively. In terms of implementation, what was the level of preparedness for implementation in terms of institutional capacity of the states, mechanisms, and of course the big hinge, finance, because a bulk of the work so far for states has been on preparing the plans. So implementation and mechanisms in place are an important topic. Just to start off with our approach, and this is really our big finding and really the one around which our report and indeed the discussion is organized around, which is climate plans, more by default than design, are treated as sustainable development plans. In the absence of a clear framework on what a climate plan is supposed to be, what you actually saw was they became placeholders for a lot of the states looking at specific local issues that they wanted to focus on and highlight. Quickly, examples like Himachal Pradesh wanted to look at payment for ecosystem services. In Orissa, reducing transmission and distribution losses was a big, and for Sikkim, it was water conservation. So these specific issues, they became a placeholder for looking at specific issues. But the question we really want to ask is that whilst they've conflated sustainable development with climate change, are the two really equal? Yes and no. Yes, as Navroz explained, development resilience, whether it's better agricultural productivity, whether it's better rural infrastructure or water conservation, provide adaptation gains. And no, because these plans then don't look at what climate impacts in the future will do to a business as usual development scenario. So these plans, for instance, don't look at hydropower generation and investment in hydropower generation given future precipitation or rainfall trends, or infrastructure along the coast given sea rise predictions. To get that climate resilient, sustainable development, to look at this, the real hinge then is the use of relevant scientific knowledge. And what we saw was that plans were inadequately rooted in the relevant scientific knowledge on climate change. And the reasons for this were time constraints, but more capacity issues in terms of accessing this information of the level required, of the downscaled model projections actually required, of the granularity that states needed to make an efficient call on this. I mean, if I can give you an example, a lot of the states used secondary data that was available. And the one place that they went to was the Ministry of Environment and Forests 4x4 assessment for 4 regions in the country. And for instance, for a state like Madhya Pradesh, that wasn't featured in the study. It was that much more harder making a chapter on this. But the bigger concern is that whatever secondary data they did rely on, the final recommendations or outcomes don't seem to be adequately linked to the research that they did use. And as I noted earlier, these plans are a placeholder for local concerns, but they also balance national direction. The call for state plans actually came from the center. It was a mandate from after the National Action Plan on Climate Change was put in place. And so a common framework document was put out, and this clearly states, and a number of times, that plans need to align themselves with the National Action Plan on Climate Change and the national missions. And some states went insofar as also trying to align broad objectives with the objectives stated in some of the national missions. We saw this actually, we did a small quick study and looked at about 7 plans and water sector in 7 plans, and the water mission and their objectives are almost aligned with some of these plans. But whilst trying to balance national direction, states have perceived mixed signals about the appropriate role for mitigation. And as a result, adaptation concerns predominate. So the Common Framework document states that states need to put in place things like an emissions inventory, which is a baseline study for a low carbon or mitigation focused document. But the impression that we got from a lot of states was that they got a sense that they should de-emphasize things like a GHG inventory because it might run contrary to India's international negotiating stance. And so some states went ahead and did it anyways. Some states did it but kept it out of the purview of the climate plan. So you then had a plan that had some national direction, local concerns, not always from a climate perspective, but importantly was not the anchor for all climate work in the state. And that seems to be a concern area. Moving forward to the process. Now, as I noted earlier, process shapes whether plans follow existing departmental grooves or result in creative integration and ideas. And again, time constraints and little upfront investment in what the process design needs to be meant that a lot of states did follow some departmental silos because a lot of these plans were organized along sectors, and those specific line departments then looked at these plans. I mean, the only example I can think of is Orissa, which makes an explicit mention of attempting some sort of cross-departmental participation. But whilst that was a concern, all states sought some external inputs to varying degrees. At minimum, they had advisors and experts who helped them, advise them and help them vet plans. At the other end of the spectrum, you had Madhya Pradesh that did 13 regional workshops across agroclimatic zones. This is over and above 10 sectoral workshops in Bhopal. So it was extremely extensive. But the challenge that a lot of states faced was taking such a diverse and specific inputs and integrating it into a state level action plan. And that was a challenge. So what you see is that the consultation process was not robust enough to materially shape plans. And we found it very hard to tease how final recommendations are actually rooted back to some of the inputs from these consultation processes. And as Navroz mentioned, donors and consultants were involved. In fact, the Ministry of Environment and Forests at some point actually asked states to go to specific donors to seek some technical assistance to take these plans forward. And what we found was that donors facilitated experts. They helped them with things like the vulnerability assessment study, in some cases the GIG inventory. Some helped them synthesize the plan. There were a lot of talk about what is climate change and sectoral impacts. And whilst they bridge capacity to prepare the plan, they largely failed to enhance the state's long-term capacity on taking these plans forward and mainstreaming climate in development planning. Outcomes, as I noted earlier, was that it was very hard to tease out how research inputs and the consultation process actually tied into some of these recommendations. And because there was no systematic framework on how to formulate or even prioritize action plans, what you saw was a broad mix of statements of objective and specific actions. And the result is neither a clear vision nor a clear plan. In fact, if I can just quickly look at some of the very broad statements, and this is across the states we looked at, and these are final recommendations: promote integrated farming practices, fire management program, plans for riverbank protection, promote native forest management. So they were as broad-based as this. But interestingly, the very same state that suggests something as broad-based as riverbank protection has a recommendation that's as pinpointed as moving a specific bus depot from the capital to the outskirts just to decongest the city center. So you have that range in terms of the recommendations that were actually put forth. But the larger concern, of course, is that the recommendations are incremental rather than transformational, although there are pockets of innovation driven by individual initiative. But even in terms of pockets of innovation, if I give the example again of Orissa that used this plan to effect electricity sector reforms, or Sikkim that used the plan to actually put in place some revived hilltop lakes and springs using MGNA-REGA money to actually do this. They use existing centrally available funds to actually effect some implementation. But these are again incremental. These are not transformational. There's statements that you see in some of these plans. For instance, Karnataka talks about assessing the carrying capacity of the Western Ghats. It's a statement. It's not been debated. It's a statement. Himachal Pradesh talks of integrating climate impact studies into the zonal plans of the states. And whilst they can be transformational if actually fleshed out and taken forward, at the moment, they're statements in the plan. Now, implementation, as I noted earlier, a lot of the energy was really on the preparation of the plan. So we looked at specific factors like institutional capacity, finance, and degree of prioritization to see how actionable these plans were. And what you see is that the existing capacity of the dedicated climate change units is insufficient for stimulating and monitoring implementation. Implementation is a line department prerogative. And what we felt is a lot of the nodal agencies where these plans were housed, typically the Science and Technology Department, or in some cases the Forest and Environment Department, did not have the bureaucratic heft in some states to really be able to influence other more influential line departments like the Agricultural Department, the Energy Department, to take these plans forward. Consequently, there's also little clarity on how to mainstream recommendations in the functioning of line departments. The example of MP again stood out because here is a state and here is the department that is actually looking at nudging line departments through information-based advisories, which we think is a very interesting way to actually go out there and get line departments to voluntarily try and mainstream some sustainable development practices. And of course, budgets. Just as there was very little systematic framework in how to prioritize actions, budgets too were based on very thin analysis. And a lot of states themselves said that they should be considered indicative as best. A good example would be if you saw the range of the cumulative budgets put forth in very similar states in terms of their economic indices. One state suggested 17,000 crore rupees, which was as close to their plan outlay, in fact, when it was made in 2012 for 5 years. Another very similar states at 4,000 crore rupees or thereabouts, and another a plan that we haven't studied but very similar in size is stated 50,000 crore rupees for 5 years. So very broad range and no real sense of where these numbers have actually come from. So whilst you have some sectors in some states where there's potential for action, what you see is that in their entirety, the plans are not actionable at the moment. And before I give it back to Navroz, I think I'd like to say that what you have is an important potential in terms of an intervention that these plans can make in the development process. But that promise is not being realized just yet. I think plans need to go beyond looking at generating implementable actions and try and see how in development planning can be looked at from the point of view of environmental sustainability and of course climate resilience. So Navroz.
Thank you very much, Anu. Of course, this all sounds much neater now than it did when we were actually sort of wading through all these plans. So there's a lot of detail and nuance in this that hopefully we'll get into. You know, at CPR, we tend to sort of pride ourselves on asking difficult questions, and then when we get asked the difficult questions of what you do about it, we often don't have very good answers. In this case, we